Today, we are going to be talking about if the Philadelphia Eagles, after their Super Bowl win, have the makings of the next NFL great dynasty team run, whatever you want to call it. We're going to talk about Myles Garrett's trade request, why I think he will be traded, what the package is going to look like in some destinations for him, as well Aaron Rodgers and Deebo Samuel, two veteran players potentially on the move. Let's hop in to today's pod. All right, so I want to first talk about the Philadelphia Eagles and their potential as a dynasty. And I know that there's going to be some controversy about this. You're an Eagles fan. They won one Super Bowl. Dynasty talk too soon. Pump the brakes, yada, yada. I think that is unfair and misrooted. I think that anytime we have a champion in a sport, it makes plenty of sense to look at their next half decade, 5 years, 3 to 5 years, and say, how many more do we think they could win? What is their window size? And do they have the makings of the next great team in their sport? We did it with Kansas City the past 2 years, and nobody really batted an eye at it because we looked at them as, hey, they won in 2019. They have Patrick Mahomes, a guy who is potentially, the next GOAT of the sport in competition with Tom Brady. And the Rams, it was interesting because we knew that a lot of their teams were veterans and Aaron Donald was retiring, Stafford's old, Cooper Kupp, not that he was old at the time that they won, but how long of a runway did he really have? And he had dealt with some injuries. Odell was on the team. Like, it was an older team. So we haven't really had a team like Philadelphia who is young at its core, has a deep roster, but doesn't have what we consider to be, nobody's talking about Jalen Hurts. Is he going to be the greatest player of all time type player? So we haven't had that in the NFL for a long time in terms of just a really, really great roster without an all-time amazing player in terms of top 5 discussions win a Super Bowl that is still young enough that it's like, how many more could they rattle off? Philly's in that spot. And I think it's fair when you look at this roster, you look at how much harder it is to advance in the AFC because of all the great quarterbacks in that conference, to think that Philadelphia in a weaker NFC, in an NFC, the AFC is clearly the conference of, hey, this is your quarterback conference, whereas the NFC is clearly your roster conference. And that really plays into an organization like Philly, who has the best owner GM combination in the NFC and perhaps in the NFL, has a really young roster, has drafted really well over the last couple of years. Look at the guys they've brought in: Jalen Carter, Quinyon Mitchell, Nolan Smith, Cooper DeJean, Nakobe Dean, all drafted very recently. This is a team that is performing, of course, at a high level, but has some sustainability to it. You look at the offensive side of the ball: Jalen Hurts, 26. Saquon Barkley, 28, a little older, but not, still 2 years left on this deal and just came off a 2,000-yard season. A.J. Brown, he's pretty young, around 26. Devonta Smith, what's he, 24, 25. Jahan Dotson's fairly young. Lane Johnson's the only guy on the offensive line where retirement may be imminent in the near future, but he already said he's coming back for next year. So when you look at Philly, there is some level of, hey, the best players on this team are young and under contract. Why would they not be favored to do it again? What about their path is significantly changing from this year to next year? Could the roster get better? I think it could. Could it get worse? That also could happen. Some potential key players that could be on the move: Milton Williams, 25 years old, defensive tackle, 2 sacks, a strip sack, forced fumble recovery in the Super Bowl. That's a guy that's going to garner a lot of interest in free agency, especially because I think Philly showed you how important interior pressure could be in the Super Bowl. Josh Sweat, guy who many were arguing could have been Super Bowl MVP, six tackles, 2.5 sacks. The guy played really good. Zach Bond, all-pro linebacker, who Philly got in a 1-year deal, took him off the Saints special team squad. And all of a sudden, this guy has a case for being a top 3 linebacker in the sport. I think it's pretty unlikely that Philly loses him. I think worst case scenario, Howie Roseman and that front office know the impact that Zach Bond has had and also know the difficulties that they've had as a franchise of getting elite linebackers, and they would franchise tag him. Truthfully, I think Zach Bond will for sure be an Eagle next year because that's the way the business goes. And Darius Slay, I think, unfortunately, is a potential cut candidate. He said he wants to play 1 more year, but when you have Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Keely Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, a guy you could bring back for a lot cheaper than you're paying Darius Slay. If you got to cut costs somewhere, you're pretty strong at corner. Obviously, you don't want to lose Slay, but in terms of meaning paying Zach Bond to have a presence at linebacker and shoring up the line, if you know the Philadelphia Eagles, you know Howie Roseman is going to prioritize that front 7 over those back 4. Especially when you have Quinyon and Cooper on rookie deals. So Slay would probably be the most likely to be gone. Zach Bond most likely to be retained. I think there's a lot of options for this team at defensive line, whether it's bringing back Milton Williams and rolling out a line of, Nolan Smith, Jalex Hunt, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Milton Williams, Jomo, and just kind of having a rotation. And maybe you bring in a veteran player. I haven't looked fully into the defensive end free agents at this point in time, but a cheaper veteran option. Maybe you bring back a Javon Hargrave. And, Philly likes to have their rotation of defensive linemen. They like to be fresh at that spot. That is one of their philosophies as a franchise. Have a fresh defensive line. It's 4 versus 5, but Philly makes it 7-8 versus 5 because of how fresh they keep guys. Like I mentioned, the offense is locked into place. And the offense is really locked in for the next 2 to 3 years, which I really think opens up this window. Jalen Hurts, you got him signed. His contract is also designed for a second contract with Philadelphia. So I think Jalen Hurts is set to be an Eagle for the next decade, truthfully. Top 5 quarterback in the sport, in my opinion. I think consensusly everybody would have him in the top 10 at this point. You have an MVP level player at the running back position in Saquon Barkley. I know that the Super Bowl wasn't exactly a shining performance from Saquon, but the guy became the 9th running back ever with 2,000 yards, had the most rushing yards ever in an NFL season from start to finish when you include the postseason. I don't think that anybody needs a full history breakdown of how important Saquon was, but the recent game that he played against the Chiefs, he wasn't a big part of their, Super Bowl victory from a stats perspective. A.J. Brown looks fully locked in. Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, Jahan Dotson, these receiving weapons, this core, that's going to be together. Maybe you bring in a veteran player here or there as a 4th option, whether it's like a Noah Brown, a Lamadai Zacchaeus type player, but ultimately this will be your core. The offensive line, Mailata, Dickerson, Jurgens, Lane Johnson will be there. Becton's the guy that the team does have to bring back. I'm interested to see what kind of contract and money he garners because before this year, obviously, it wasn't exactly a very strong showing for Becton, but they certainly have the possibility. And this team is just in a really good spot roster-wise for the next 3 years. For the next 2 to 3 years, for sure. The core of this roster is here. And key pieces are locked up for the next 4 to 5. So when you look at what Philly's ceiling is and where they could go, could they rattle off 2 more Super Bowls in the next 5 years? I think it's possible. And then all of a sudden you're talking about a team that's won 3 Super Bowls in the last 6 years. That to me is a dynasty. Do you view Kansas City from 2018 to 2024 as a dynasty? I do. They made 2 Super Bowls there. If you go back 2 years, Philly has made 2 of the last 3. They won one. If they were to rattle off 2 of the next 4, that's a pretty strong stretch. 3 Super Bowls in a 7-year stretch with 4 appearances. You know, when you look at it from a broad idea of things, that's certainly possible. This Eagles team reminds me a ton of that first Legion of Boom, well, I guess the only Legion of Boom Super Bowl victory, where they went into that Super Bowl with the best defense in football, similar to Philly, and they were up against Peyton Manning and the Broncos, who had just had the best offense in football. Now, the Chiefs were not the best offense in football all year, but they had Mahomes, they have the best quarterback, they have Andy Reid, the best offensive mind. Everybody kind of looked at them as like, yeah, those are the guys to beat, back-to-back champs, similar spot. Younger team and underdog team that everybody thought the roster was really good, but they didn't know if they could trust the quarterback in the big game, and obliteration. 43-8. This was 40-22, but it was 40-6 up until 3 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. Just complete annihilation. If you remember, Seattle gets back to the Super Bowl the following year. Brady orchestrates the comeback, but at the 1-yard line, they don't hand the ball off. They throw that interception. But they could have been back-to-back champs. And I think after that Super Bowl loss for Seattle, a lot of confidence was lost in Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson. Marshawn Lynch and a lot of the players on that team have come out and said frustrations and tempers were high, and the culture kind of fell apart there. But if they won that Super Bowl and the culture doesn't fall apart, could Seattle have won another one in the following 3 years? Yeah, I think so. I think we're one Marshawn Lynch run away from potentially looking at Seattle as the best team of the 2010s. Instead, we look at it as the Patriots. And so be it. That's the way that the cookie crumbled. But for Philly, you know, I look at this team, and we talked about it on Monday's pod. This is the best Super Bowl team of the 2020s thus far. This Eagles team would have beaten the last 2 Chiefs teams and the Rams team. No doubt about it in my mind. That's how I felt about the Legion of Boom Seahawks team. Philly goes out, and again, the path doesn't change that much next year. We'll see what roster moves are made, and we'll talk about Myles Garrett, and Max Crosby could potentially be on the move, and if they go to a Detroit or a Washington or a Green Bay, could things certainly shake up? Injuries, yes. But on paper, as we look at it now, there's no reason to think that Philly couldn't be in this position next year. There's no roster in the NFL, really, but especially the NFC, that is better than where Philadelphia is right now. So, could they be a dynasty in terms of, you know, I'm not saying Patriots in terms of how good that they had been over that stretch, but when I look at what the Chiefs did over the last 6 years, 7 years as a dynasty run, they had 3 Super Bowls in a 6-year stretch. Could Philly do that? I think the answer is absolutely. I think they absolutely could. And, you know, Kansas City had other Super Bowl appearances. The loss to Tampa's in there. Philly will be a very successful franchise. And it starts from top down. They have the best GM in all of football, who has crushed the draft ever since taking Rager over Justin Jefferson, which I will never fully understand how that came to be, because there wasn't a single draft board other than Philly's that had that as the case. And then to see what Justin Jefferson turned into, obviously just really compiles on that pick. Because you remember that draft, it was Waddle and CeeDee went before Justin Jefferson, but nobody crushes the Cowboys for taking CeeDee Lamb before Justin Jefferson, because look at who CeeDee Lamb turned out to be. Jalen Rager, certified bust, 1 pick before Justin Jefferson. That one stings on you. But since then, it's been perfection. And it has put the Eagles in a very advantageous spot where you have some young, really stud players on cheap deals. Jalen Carter, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Nolan Smith, Jordan Davis. Some really strong players on your defense, some that you got to pay sooner than others. But the corner position, you really don't have to pay that for the next 4 years. That gives you an extra, 20, $25 million to go and spend. And they have money in Bryce Huff right now that they can get off of. And I think that that's a good spot to transition here. Because, yes, the Eagles have the making of a dynasty, but the roster could get better. And it could feature a Myles Garrett. So Myles Garrett requests a trade. And this came out during Super Bowl Media Week, very smartly timed by Garrett and his PR team, or however you want to refer to these guys, to let this out now and talk about, let's have Myles Garrett request a trade. And he's made it pretty clear that the reason he wants to request a trade is because he's made his money, he's won his Defensive Player of the Year, he has his own accolades, he's ready to win. He's ready to be a part of winning culture. And as a guy who's played his career for the Cleveland Browns, an absolute joke of a franchise, I don't think you could blame him for wanting out. I think every single one of us, if we were in Myles Garrett's shoes, would want it. Deshaun Watson and the whole murky quarterback situation, it's just a lot of BS going on in Cleveland right now. What's the direction of the franchise? He wants to play for a contender. He's on a team that has the number 2 overall pick in the draft. And he very flat out said that he only wants to go to a contender, right? They talked to him about, what if the Titans trade for you on Media Row? And he said, why would I go to the Titans? Why would I up and move my entire life and family and situation to go play for another team that is subpar? So right off the rip, any team that isn't a contender, you can cut him off of the potential list of where Myles Garrett's going. He's not going to the Titans. He's not going to the Raiders. Not going to the Giants. He's not leaving his current situation to make a lateral move in terms of winning teams. And I think after the Super Bowl, the performance you saw from the Eagles defensive line, the price on Myles Garrett just went up. Because quarterback is the most important position in football. There's no doubt about it. But the next most important part is, can you disrupt the other team's quarterback by generating a pass rush? It's not to say that edge rushers are the next most important position, although those are the guys that generally get home. But can you develop pressure, and can you do it with 4 is huge. The 2 times Patrick Mahomes has lost in the Super Bowl, where did it stem from? A team getting pressure with 4. Well, having Myles Garrett on that line almost assures you can get pressure with 4. Without a doubt. At least some of the time. And then have 7 back in coverage. So what is the price on Myles Garrett? And let's be realistic here. Because you're going to hear what I'm going to say, and you're going to tell me I'm crazy. But when you factor in Myles Garrett still in the prime of his athletic years, at least for the next 2 years, when you factor in the fact that we don't quite often see a top 3 defensive player in the league get moved, when you factor in the importance of the position that he plays, and when you factor in what the competition is going to be, because every team at the top is going to be going after Myles Garrett. There is going to be a bidding war taking place. This isn't a situation like in the NBA where you could say, I want to go to this team, and then every other team's out. It's not going to be a bidding war between every NFL team. We're down to 10 when it comes to Super Bowl contenders. But these 10 Super Bowl contenders are going to be bidding on Garrett. So what's the asking price? Multiple first rounders. For starters, your team will have to trade minimum 2 first-round picks. That is a guarantee. I think you're also going to have to trade, whether it's a second and you get back a 4th, a 3rd and you get back a 6th. There's going to be other draft capital there. Minimum 2 firsts plus an additional pick in the first 3 rounds, and then you get back a pick below the first 3 rounds. I think that's a lock. Then it's, do you have young talent Cleveland could be interested in? You remember back to the Russell Wilson trade. The Eagles, Commanders, and Broncos were all interested in Russell Wilson at that time. The Broncos were able to offer Drew Lock, a young quarterback who Seattle could see what they have, Noah Fant, a young vertical threat tight end, plus draft capital. Washington was able to offer more draft capital, but Seattle wasn't interested in the players that they had. These GMs want to have some immediate talent that they could go to their owner with, that the coach can start to work with immediately, that they've seen in the NFL and believe in. So if you're a team that's trading for a Myles Garrett, expect to also be moving a young player in return. I think the package is going to be that high. When was the last time we've seen a defensive end the caliber of Myles Garrett be traded? I don't know if it's happened in my lifetime. Is it Reggie White from the Eagles to the Packers? Am I missing something? But JJ Watt was towards the end of his run, and I think he may have left Houston in free agency. Somebody could fact check me on this in the comments section, but the talent of Myles Garrett isn't usually on the block. Maybe Khalil Mack, if you remember when Mack was traded, but he garnered 2 first-rounders. And that was pretty recent. And again, for anybody asking the why, pass rush is the second most important thing that an NFL team can have. No debate about it. Myles Garrett is an elite talent at that spot. He is a no doubt top 3 defensive end in football. It's TJ Watt, Micah Parsons, and Myles Garrett, ordered however you want. But Myles Garrett has the ability to be an absolute game wrecker. There's not a lot of people, exclude quarterbacks here. How many players in the NFL can single-handedly change a game? Exclude quarterbacks. Who can flip a game on its head? Saquon Barkley, we've seen him do it this year. Derrick Henry, we've seen him do it before. A healthy Christian McCaffrey, but I'm not going to include that because we don't even know where he's at on his health. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Myles Garrett, TJ Watt, Micah Parsons. Are we including, we get to some maybes in Chris Jones, Fred Warner, Stingley, Pat Surtain. We get to some maybes there. But outside of the quarterback position, if you were to draft players in the NFL, Myles Garrett would be a top 7 pick. For one season, obviously. We're not factoring in age here. Obviously, we will a little bit in terms of trade, but in terms of what I was saying there. You're doing a fantasy draft of all the NFL players for one season. And quarterbacks are all off the board. Myles Garrett's a top 7 pick. That he has the ability to change the outcome of the game, not at the quarterback position. That is very rare. So he's going to garner a lot. What teams do I believe will be interested in Myles Garrett? That Myles Garrett will also be interested in. I talked about it a second ago, but the Philadelphia Eagles. He wants to play for a Super Bowl contender. Well, they just won the damn thing. The Eagles are not paying a lot of guys on that defense. So they can afford a Myles Garrett extension. It may eventually result in losing some guys, but it'll result in Josh Sweat's gone, Milton Williams is gone, Darius Slay is gone. They have a contract in Bryce Huff, who has proven to be at least an interesting player when used correctly. The Jets had him playing at a high level. He couldn't get there this year in Philly. But if you're the Browns front office, you could say we are returning an edge rusher. We are filling the position immediately with a guy we've seen have success. Philly has the draft capital, and it is expendable for them because of how many picks they've hit on in a row. I know if you're not an Eagles fan, the first 25 minutes of this pod may have not been the great for you, but Philly can get this done. Philly can for sure get this done. The Buffalo Bills. If you are the Buffalo Bills, and even include the Baltimore Ravens in this statement, you guys have been so close to Kansas City, yet so far away, time and time again in the AFC. This past AFC's championship, Mahomes gets it done over Buffalo. The year before that, Mahomes gets it done over the Ravens. you know, these guys feel like they're right there. And then you watch the Eagles, who can generate a pass rush with 4, absolutely annihilate this guy. And you have to be thinking to yourself, well, there's the formula. We have to get a pass rush to annihilate him. Baltimore, I'm kind of pulling out of this. I don't think that they can get Myles Garrett from Cleveland. I think Cleveland is very much more likely to trade him to an NFC team, but I think Buffalo could be desperate enough that they could oversell on a package here. I don't know who exactly that would include that they love. Maybe it's 3 first-round picks. Maybe Buffalo's like really willing to mortgage it all for right now to get Myles Garrett. But they could not get home remotely close to the way Philly was able to get home 2 weeks prior. So Buffalo should certainly be all in on Garrett and Crosby. The Chiefs themselves. Karlaftis is nice. Charles Omenihu is nice. But you did just get dog walked in the Super Bowl. And you couldn't get a lick of pressure. And Philly's got the best offensive line in football. So I hear you there. But Brett Veach is a top 3 GM in the sport, who his window is constantly open because he has Patrick Mahomes. Travis Kelce may be retiring. That's a lot of money off the books. You could fill that with Myles Garrett. Now, I think the Chiefs have some other priorities and would probably be sooner to invest in the offensive line than the defensive line, as their defense has been so strong, and they run a lot of those exotic blitzes, but you can't rule them out. The Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions is a big one. Now, obviously, Aiden Hutchinson was injured, but a spade's a spade. At the end of this season, Detroit's downfall was their defense, and especially their inability to get pressure. That playoff game versus the Commanders, Jaden Daniels did whatever he wanted to them because he had the time to absolutely pick them apart. Detroit will be better, the defense will be healthy, but if you're Detroit, you have to pick up the phone and say, can we create a pass rusher duo of Myles Garrett and Aiden Hutchinson? Because if we can, 1, we're stopping Philly from getting better and getting him. 2, we are solidifying ourselves as, hey, it's us and Philly. That's tier 1 in the NFC, and that's it. Because even though they lost that playoff game to Washington, I think if you had people rank the NFC teams going into next year healthy, Detroit would be above Washington on many lists. The Green Bay Packers. I think the Packers this offseason is huge. Very make or break. Because, to me, no doubt the Bears will be better next year. The Vikings were already really good and better than the Packers this year, and Detroit was better than the Packers this year. You have Matt LaFleur, Jordan Love. The time to win is now. They couldn't really generate a pass rush. Myles Garrett obviously fixes that. I think Minnesota sneakily calls, but I think there's some questions at the quarterback spot that maybe they don't want to invest all the draft capital. Chicago could be interesting. I don't know if Myles Garrett views them as a Super Bowl contender and would extend there. Washington. I think Washington is a sleeper team. Ton of money. Does Myles Garrett view them as a true contender? Or did he view this as a Cinderella run? Obviously, that's up to Myles Garrett. I think that he would extend in Washington, I would imagine. But you could see right there the conversation that we just had about this. There's going to be a lot of suitors. A lot of suitors for Myles Garrett. And that's going to drive the price up, man. Because when you have Buffalo offering whatever they're offering, 3 first-round picks and no player, 2 first-round picks and a player. Detroit's got the same offer. Philly's got the same offer. Green Bay's got the same offer. Who's going to differentiate themselves and be like, yeah, balls on the table, get me Myles Garrett now? Who's going to do it? Somebody's going to do it. And it's going to be a true truly league-altering trade when it happens. Let's talk about some veterans on the move. Aaron Rodgers looks like he's gonna have a new team, and the Jets have basically confirmed, hey, we're going to be moving off of Aaron Rodgers. We're going to be going in another direction. And I think that this is the right direction for the New York Jets franchise. Let's start there. You're bringing in a new GM. You're bringing in a new coach. You're trying to develop a new culture. It is best to clear house of anything of the previous administration. And a lot of times these front offices want their guys, their quarterbacks, their head coaches. They want to pick the direction of the franchise because usually as an NFL GM, if you get fired, you don't get another opportunity. It's not really like the head coaching carousel. So if you're coming in and you're now taking over the New York Jets and this has been a disaster of a franchise and you are tasked with turning it around, do you really want the 40-plus-year-old quarterback who, you know, whether it's true or not, seems to be a bit of a headache for front offices, wants to do things his way, kind of stuck in the mud, not the game changer he once was? I'm not going to go as far to say Aaron Rodgers is washed completely. I still think you could be a playoff team with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, and we'll talk about that for where I think he might go in a second. But if you're the Jets, where you're going culturally, the young talent on your team, you kind of want to peel the Band-Aid off and start over. You have Breece Hall, you have Garrett Wilson, some young offensive players. Quinnen Williams, Quincy Williams, Sauce Gardner, some good defensive talent. An O-line that's been improving. Olu Fashanu out of Penn State, you got him going forward, so you got a tackle of the future. The Jets aren't, in my opinion, a playoff team next year. But in 2 to 3 years, they could get there. They could flip this around if they play things the correct way. So, that's not really exactly a quarterback-heavy draft. But I think, personally, if I was the Jets, I'd be much more likely to want to go into next year with a transitional quarterback, whether that's a Gardner Minshew, a Joe Flacco, whoever it may be, a Justin Fields, let's give him a shot, Russell Wilson for 1 year, and drafting a Jackson Dart, a Jalen Milroe, and seeing if we could develop that player rather than running it back with Rodgers. Because the roster isn't in a place to win a Super Bowl with Rodgers. Clearly, we saw that this year. Could they be better if they were better coached and a little less dysfunction and have made a playoff run? Maybe, but they were never getting past the likes of Kansas City and Baltimore and Buffalo. They were a one-and-done playoff team. It would have looked like what Pittsburgh was in the playoffs if they had had their best season. Their best outcome was being the Steelers. And obviously it didn't happen. They didn't have their best outcome. And I think it's best to peel off the bandage and move on from Rodgers. Like I said, the question is Aaron Rodgers washed? I don't think he's washed. I don't think he is elite by any measure anymore. He had good statistical numbers when it came down to the end of the year, and I really thought the last month and a half he started to play some better football. Maybe it's the recovery time from the Achilles. It just took longer because Rodgers is older and he finally got back to where he should be at towards the end of the season. Maybe it was the addition of Devontae Adams and just getting more comfortable. A lot changed there. Some of it because of Rodgers, some of it likely not. And ultimately, I don't think he's washed, but I don't think he's top 10. I think he probably hovers around 15, 16. We're going to do the quarterback tier list on Friday, but, he's decent. He's a decent player. So where's he going to go? I look up the odds on the next team. I think this is from DraftKings. I didn't write it down. Steelers are plus 200. Raiders are plus 300. 49ers plus 350. Vikings plus 400. Those are teams that were under 5-1. Those are teams I'm considering real players. I think the 49ers at plus 350 is really unlikely. I think that number signifies a little bit more skepticism coming out of San Francisco for extending Brock Purdy, which I do think is the correct choice of field, but I just don't see them going to Rodgers. I think you would just play out another year with Purdy. The Steelers. The Steelers is very possible. Tomlin likes vets. Pittsburgh, for right or for wrong, feels like their roster is good enough to compete, but the quarterback has continuously been the issue. And for what it's worth, I do think it's a continual upgrade. From Kenny Pickett, upgrade to Russell Wilson. I think Rodgers is better than Russ. I think he could run a better offense. I think his pre-snap diagnosis is better. I think the arm talent at this point in time is still better. Not as mobile, but I think you could live with that. I think Pittsburgh could be an actual threat with Rodgers if they also brought in Devontae Adams. Because if you look at this team and it's like, well, they have Adams, Pickens, Freiermuth. They draft O-line again, start improving there. You have a defense with TJ Watt, with Minkah Fitzpatrick, with Patrick Queen, with bodies. You could look at Pittsburgh and be like, hey, this is a playoff team, and if Rodgers is playing his best football any given Sunday, am I going to pick them to win the Super Bowl? No, but I do think they'd make the playoffs again with Rodgers. And if that's the goal for Pittsburgh, like, hey, let's just be a competent enough franchise to keep being in the playoffs, I think Rodgers could get you there. The Raiders is interesting. I kind of don't buy it. I don't know why they'd go Rodgers. The only thing that I could think of as to why they'd go Rodgers is because they think their roster is so far off talent-wise that they're like, let's pay Rodgers for a year or two, build up the rest of this foundation for a quarterback when we're ready for one. It's not a quarterback-heavy draft. We're not even really that vested in a Shedeur Sanders. Maybe we draft like a Jackson Dart later in the draft and see if he could sit behind Rodgers and develop. I guess I could see that if the move to the Raiders would feel like just solely we're trying to move tickets and sell jerseys. The Vikings is interesting at plus 400. First off, the exact career path of Brett Favre going for Rodgers now of Green Bay, the Jets, the Vikings would be hilarious. Is Aaron Rodgers better than Sam Darnold? I don't know. But I think it's a fair conversation. Do you think J.J. McCarthy's ready to take the reins, or would you rather him sit behind Rodgers for a year? Because I think if it's Minnesota, it's a one-year deal. And you're just trying to say, hey, we were so good last year. We don't know if McCarthy's ready. He's still so young. We can sit him an additional year, and he'll still be a starter at the age of 23, which is the case for most people. He'd get a year behind one of the top 10 quarterbacks ever in the sport in Aaron Rodgers. And if we truly believe Rodgers is as good, if not better than Sam Darnold, what was the problem with Darnold? The second the game got big, I mean, you talk about choke. The guy turned into a complete pumpkin. I mean, the clock struck midnight on Cinderella Sam Darnold, week 18 in that playoff game. I'm not saying Rodgers would have won those games, but damn, he wouldn't have looked like that. So I'm not dismissing it. If anything, I do lean Pittsburgh, but I'm not dismissing Minnesota. And then Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel was given permission to seek a trade by the 49ers. Deebo's got 1 year left on his contract, a $15.8 million cap hit left on the deal. The year after that is a potential void year in the contract. I'd imagine whatever team is bringing in Deebo Samuel would be voiding that last year and viewing it as a one-year deal. $16 million is a lot for Deebo, but it's a movable contract, especially when you consider teams that have QBs on rookie deals. And Deebo's fully acknowledged this on Twitter, so I do believe that it's more likely now than ever. We've heard Deebo's name in trade talks before, but I think it's more likely now than ever. From the 49ers perspective, I think it makes sense. You have a lot of money in this weapons core, or I should say a lot of talent, at least. And you got to work on that offensive line. You got to bring in guys. You got to draft guys. Like, that offensive line's a problem. Trent Williams, if he retires, you are straight SOL. Straight SOL. Every asset the Niners have has to go into improving that offensive line. When you look at the receiving core, Brandon Ayuk should be back for week 1. Tore his ACL, I think, early enough in the year that I expect him to be back. Ricky Pearsall, he was looking pretty good at the end of the season once he fully got healthy and into the system. Jawan Jennings may be the best wide receiver 3 in the sport. You still have George Kittle. Christian McCaffrey, what will he be, what won't he be? I think at worst he's still a fine receiving back. Like, there is enough talent around Brock Purdy to win if there's a good offensive line and that's your receiving core. Deebo's the odd man out. 1 year left on the deal, kind of injury prone, older, doesn't really have a full spot and is taking snaps away from a Ricky Pearsall at a certain point. So I fully understand the moving of Deebo Samuel. The question is where, and again, these were the teams with the top 4 odds. Pittsburgh, I don't really think makes a lot of sense, especially if I do think they might go in the Rodgers situation. I think they're much more likely to go get Devontae Adams than Deebo as well. I just don't think, unless Pittsburgh's drafting a rookie quarterback, I don't see what Deebo does for them. He's not really a needle mover for that team. The Denver Broncos, I think this one's interesting. The Broncos didn't really have a full underneath yak wide receiver this year. Cortland Sutton, 50-50 big body guy, and Mims, Franklin, like those are deep threat guys. Deebo as the slot wide receiver for the Broncos, while Bo Nix is on the rookie deal. You just made the playoffs. He could progress and get better. The defense was really strong. You know, I think that makes a lot of sense. I would be shocked if the Broncos don't bring in a wide receiver this offseason. I think they would prioritize a T. Higgins, absolutely, but only one team can get T. Higgins. You have to have pivot plans, and Deebo to the Broncos as their pivot, I don't hate. The Carolina Panthers, getting any sliver of weapons to help Bryce Young further develop, I'm on board for. Their receiving core right now, Xavier Legette, Adam Thielen, was it David Moore? They could get better. Deebo's an improvement to that receiving room. And again, Carolina's not looking to win the Super Bowl next year, but they need some real clarification on, hey, is Bryce Young the guy we want to invest in? Because he finished the year really strong, but if Carolina had to extend him this offseason, I can't imagine they're like, let's give that guy $55 million a year, especially what they saw happen with Miami and Jacksonville and Dallas. The Commanders. The Commanders is interesting because, again, they could use an underneath guy. Terry McLaurin, nice deep threat. De'Ami Brown really showed out in the playoffs. Zach Ertz was kind of their underneath guy, but having Deebo in their slot, another weapon for Jaden Daniels, their window is now. So this would make a decent amount of sense. I think the Houston Texans are also a name to watch. With the Tank Dell injury and Stephon Diggs coming off of a torn ACL and being a free agent, Houston has to bring in another wide receiver. They have to. Nico Collins, big body guy, deep threat, not going to be the slot guy. CJ, how much do they improve the offensive line? I don't know, but it gets pressured a ton. Having a quick option to dump the ball off to would be huge, but I do believe Deebo's injury concerns would worry them because it's like, hey, this guy gets injured and we're back to where we were last year at the end of last year with Mix and Nico and a bunch of guys, and CJ is going to get crushed again because they're just going to bracket Nico. So Houston's an interesting name to look out for. I just think they're in the market for a wide receiver. But, gun to head, you got to pick a spot for Deebo next year. I think I land on Denver because I don't think they get T. Higgins. I think he's pretty similar to Cortland Sutton. I think they'd almost be better served targeting a slot guy. But that could be Cooper Kupp, who also potentially could be on the move. But those were some vet players that I think are going to be on the move. That's all I got for you guys today on this pod. I think I'm going to come up with a name for it. I'm leaning towards 1st and 30. I thought about the Dylan Mel show. I don't know. Not really football-y enough, in my opinion, for me. So I think I might go back to 1st and 30. OGs will remember, and maybe put a graphic up or something. But I'm going to be coming to you guys with these longer style videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. There could be a lot of experimentation. We're in the off season now. So seriously, any ideas that you guys have, comment them down below. Friday's edition of this will be the quarterback tier list. It's going to be pretty in depth. We're going to talk a lot. I'm going to try and get 40, 45 minutes there, really talking about each and every one of those quarterbacks. That way, 1, every team is covered. Nobody feels left out. But 2, really explaining my rankings for these guys. I appreciate your support. We're in the off season. The grind continues. However, I appreciate y'all. If you haven't already, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I'll catch you next time. Peace.